Welcome to Radical Underdogs. I am out at Cadwell Park tomorrow, so I'm just going to take you through some of the checks I do on the Mazda before we take it to a track day or a race day, and some of these checks we do in between races as well. If you're interested, there is going to be a full list in the description. When the car comes in off the track, we make sure the GPSs are off, cameras off, the pin is back in the fire extinguisher. We do check tyre temperatures, tyre pressures. We do check the oil. That's a really important bit. This car burns quite a lot of oil. In the wet, this burns a lot less oil, I think, because there's less time on full throttle. In the dry, in a 20-minute session, I can probably burn 200 or 300 millilitres of oil. It's quite a lot. Next step is to check for leaks, checking coolant and brake fluid in particular. For the brake fluid, I have added a UV dye, so I can have a look with this black light and see whether there's any leaks going on there. The coolant does have a little bit of a leak. I think it's coming from the water pump. We're not going to change it this time out because we're only running this car 15-20 minutes at a time. It's not such a big issue. And the next step is to jack the car up. At home in the workshop is a lot easier. I've got a lift. With the car in the air, you can check whether there's any issues with any wheel bearings. Do that on all four wheels. Okay, next up, the wheels come off. At the track, I've got a battery operated impact wrench. At home, I'm using the air power. Okay, first of all, we're looking at the brakes, checking that there's nothing foreign object stuck in there or anything like that. We're looking at the brake pad thickness, making sure that's still okay. We're going to have a look at also the suspension components, making sure there's nothing obviously broken. And what we'll do after that is get a spanner on each of the major bolts and make sure they're all still tight. You would be surprised about what comes undone over the curbs on a racetrack. Fortunately for the Mazda, a lot of things are 17mm bolt, 17mm socket heads. So a 17mm spanner will do you for a lot of things. On the stock version of the Mazda, these are not 17mm socket heads. There's, I think, 14s, I think. The anti-roll bar links are, for me anyway, the thing that comes undone the most. The other key thing to look for and check is the alignment bolts. Those are the bolts over here at the other end of the wishbone, and they keep the suspension geometry aligned. They often, especially if they've been recently put on, can come loose because a lot of stress goes through them. And obviously I've marked them up so I know roughly where they should be, so they shouldn't be loose because they are exactly where marked. So these ones are completely tight. This one is at the track. This would be done. Now, because we're back at the workshop, what I'm going to do is also grease the slider pins on the brake calipers. As you can see, there's still quite a lot of grease on this slider pin, and well, that's to be expected. The car's only been used on circuit for about, well, less than 2 hours circuit time, because it's only 45 minutes circuit time on a race day, and the test day I only had an hour, so it's less than 2 hours circuit time. So it's not surprising that there's still a lot of grease on here. What I'll do anyway is I'll clean it up and put it back on again. Okay, and this side is now done. I'm going to change the setup from a wet setup to a dry because I am, if nothing else, optimistic. And for me, all the dry setup involves is changing the pressures on the tyres. For me, I've got 2 sets of tyres, one set to a wet pressure, which for these Avon tyres is much higher than the dry setup. The dry setup in terms of PSI is down in the 20s. For me, in the wet, up in the 40s. I know some people even go higher than that for these tyres. For the clicks on the suspension, again, it's much higher in the dry than in the wet. For me, again, sort of upper ranges, sort of 13, 14, maybe a bit less than that, depending on the circuit. And I go one step harder at the front than at the rear. And I think that's just to dial in a slightly more conservative setup. I don't know if that actually ends up working or not. And that's it, the tyres go back on. And I should have actually mentioned that the pressures I'm talking about are hot pressures. So they will be 2, 3, 4, maybe, even that many PSI different from your cold pressures. So that's why what you see at track days, for example, is people going out for a few laps, getting the tyres nice and warm, coming in and checking the tyre pressures from there. And the other thing I should have mentioned around setup, of course, is that you've got your camber, caster and toe. That's not set up with the car up in the air, it's set up with the car on the ground. I've got a string line kit, which I do. It's probably the subject of a whole other video, to be honest. Again, my setup for this is pretty standard for a race car. You've got slight toe out on the front, not too much. a couple of well, I've got a millimetre each tyre, and I try to keep it more or less at 0 at the rear, if anything, a little bit of a toe in. There's quite a large degree of camber because, of course, you're cornering quite hard on these things, so camber gives you a bit more grip in the corners if you've got a bit camber. So for me, again, it's 2.5 degrees, but a lot of people have more than that in camber. Similar amount on the rear, slightly more camber on the rear, and that seems to work okay for me. I think it's a good place to start if you don't know what you're doing. If you do know what you're doing, I wouldn't follow me, to be honest, because I'm mid-pack towards the back of my field in racing. So probably find someone who's at the front and copy their setup if they're willing to share it with you. As I was putting on these rear wheels, I did remember that I forgot to mention that crossweight also an important part of setup. I try and set mine to 50% and keep it there. You can do it with some very expensive motorsport scales, or you can do it with some cheap eBay alternatives. Not that cheap, actually. That's exactly what I do. And the other thing, of course, is to make sure that there's no pickup on the inside of the wheels. What I mean by pickup is the rubber that's left on the circuit. So you'll find that, especially if you're not used to doing track days, you'll find little bits of rubber everywhere, and you wonder what those things are, but that's actually bits of tyre that have fallen off. Mostly other people's tyres, that come off slick tyres and stuff like that, and they'll find their way on the inside of tyres. If they build up enough, they'll end up unbalancing the wheel, so it is important to tidy that up when you get the wheels off. I don't want to teach grandma to suck eggs, but obviously it's quite easy to over-torque the wheel bolts with a big impact gun like this, so I've set mine to the middle setting. I know that for me that brings it slightly under the torque setting for these wheels, and I go around afterwards with a torque wrench and do the clicks. I'm not going to go through every single wheel because the process is pretty much the same. Wobble check the wheels, wheel comes off, look for any obvious damage, check all the bolts are nice and tight. If you've got some time and it's at the workshop before you go on your track day, definitely recommend greasing those slider pins on the brakes. Make sure the setup is all okay, and then car down, well, wheel on obviously first, car down and away you go. And obviously before going out onto the circuit, you're going to want fuel in the car. For the race car, what we do is we empty all the fuel and then put back exactly what we need. For track time in the dry, we go for 1 litre every 2 minutes plus 5 litres. For a track day, you probably don't need to be doing this. This is so that we're keeping the weight around 1 or 2 kilos above the minimum championship limit, just to be safe. And you can see the fuel pump struggling a bit, and straight away switch it off so we don't end up running the fuel pump dry. That's pretty much it. Make sure you put the bonnet down, put the pins in the bonnet, because I didn't do that last time, and it is on my list, so I didn't check my list. Put the pins in the bonnet, pins in the boot lid as well. I've got taken the boot lid off the hinges to save weight. And then, car's fueled up, fire it up and ready to go.